All right, are we all good? Okay. Hi, everyone. My name is Morgan Arneson. I'm a member of AMSA's Community and Public Health Action Committee, and today we are going to be discussing racial disparities in healthcare. Excuse me one. And reducing healthcare disparities and racism in healthcare. And today we have two speakers with us. Today we have Isaiah Cochran. Dr. Isaiah Cochran is a current PGY 3 family medicine resident in Daytona Beach, Florida, currently living in Orlando, Florida. He's a former national president of AMSA, and he's currently serving on the board of Lower Drug Prices Now as vice president of Prescription Justice. And he's on the advisory board for Healthcare for America Now. Isaiah also serves on the AMSA Foundation Board. Isaiah is credentialed in HIV medicine. He's achieved his credentialing during his second year of residency. He will soon be working as faculty at Advent Orlando for Family Medicine, Internal Medicine residency as medical director of the Community Medical Clinic. And today we also have with us Jeffrey. I'm sorry, I don't want to pronounce his name wrong.
Cochi.
Jeffrey Cochi. Dr. Jeffrey Cochi is motivated in his personal and professional life to an international praxis informed by anti-racist, intersectional feminist, and queer framework for embodying radical reimagination of our social structures. He's engaged on this labor within what he theorizes as the caring and companioning professions, healthcare, education care, and spiritual care, each of which is an impression of human beings with one another and the individual and collective journeys of our lives. He is currently serving the American Medical Student Association as reproductive health programming strategist for the AMSA Reproductive Health Project. Previously, Jeff served as Director of Education and Experiences for AMSA, in which capacity he developed national programming and educational opportunities related to social missions of medicine. Outside of AMSA, Jeff serves as curator of critical episiotomies and meaning making for Activist Theology Project, a startup project of politicizing theology that supports people and organizations in the spiritual journey of dismantling supremacy culture. His own learning journey has included both medical training and theological training at Northwestern University, Finberg School of Medicine in Chicago, and Garrett Evangelical Theological Seminary, also in Chicago. So welcome. Thank you for being here today.
Thank you, Morgan. And Dr. Cochran, hello.
How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
Good.
So Morgan, how would you like us to proceed? Because we are here to have a conversation, and I know that there are folks who are in the Zoom room with us who can ask questions and can provide comment. But of course, Dr. Cochran and I can start with some opening thoughts, if that's how you'd like to proceed.
Yeah, we can start with some opening thoughts and maybe talk about what you believe are the biggest factors that future physicians can really take in order to really battle this issue.
Sure. Isaiah, do you want to start?
Sure. I actually was sharing with Rico that last week I had the opportunity to speak to the Racism in Medicine Scholars Program. So that was really great. And I'm grateful to be back again to speak on this topic. So number one, I know that we keep hearing this, but vote and then vote and then vote again. Why am I saying that? Because we all know that who we have in office really can open many doors for us or close many doors for us. And that's just not for us, but also for our patients. And that's one thing that I really focused on last week, and I want to drive home today is in order to have inclusion in medicine, we have to be able to have providers who look like our patients, okay? So there is actually research done by many different organizations that shows that when patients have providers who look like them or who can identify with them, you have better patient outcomes. And I also will share that I can tell you already, when I walk into patient rooms with my patients of color, more specifically my Black patients, many of them, especially the older ones, always say to me, I cannot believe I have a Black doctor. Like, you know, and I'm able to speak to them differently. And so with that in mind, I want to look at this two ways. How do we get more people of color? How do we get more people who are LGBTQ? How do we get more people into medicine? And one of the first things for me is addressing the cost of medical school, and also how arduous the process is, which is a whole nother topic, but we need to treat our doctors better. And when we see fields like tech, you know, engineering, they are booming, okay? And so people have so many options. And I just feel in order to really address the health disparities that we have, one of the biggest things is having doctors and providers who look like our patients, which is a diverse patient population. And no, not knocking anybody who does not identify with those groups, but also just speaking the facts as well. So I could go on and on and on, but I'll stop there.
I just, before I get started, I just have to say that I'm so excited to be partnered with Dr. Cochran in this conversation. I worked in my previous role at the time that Isaiah was a national leader and AMSA national president. And one of the exciting things for me in this work is just always being in direct communication and relationship with medical students and pre-med students who I feel see the world with a level of clarity that those of us who are older, have been around longer, and have been inside the system for longer are perhaps desensitized to. Perhaps less explicitly noticing and paying attention to the pretty large and significant discrepancies between what we claim to be our ethics of care within the profession and how our care is actually delivered within a context, within a system and context of inequity that's baked into the foundation of this country, into the foundation of this society. And one of the reasons why I do the work that I do in the context of AMSA is to support students, to support future physicians who are coming into this profession and coming into the profession with eyes wide open and looking around and asking why do we do it this way? Why is it this way? Why do we have these persistent problems that we keep talking about, that we keep hearing people talk about? And what are the actual solutions that are being proposed? And are those solutions actually the ones that reflect the insights and the knowledge and the experiences of those who are actually living at the intersections of oppression, of systematized oppression? And I think that our profession as a whole and historically has done a terrible job of being critical of our own complicity and our own contributions to systems of inequity. And so this conversation that I certainly hope that we can be a part of tonight is one that I want to encourage you all to feel ownership of. To feel that as the newest members of this profession, you have every right to question what it is that you are inheriting as the system, as the traditions, as the ways in which medicine has been organized, has been delivered, has been cultivated in terms of a culture within healthcare. And so, you know, if there is one thing that I want to leave you with tonight, and if there's one thing that I wanted to say, and then it was like, peace out, I'll see you later, I've said what I want to say, is that you have every right to question the system that you're coming into, because the system that you're coming into is deeply, 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 deeply flawed and deeply, deeply complicit in very significant and egregious acts of failure of ethics, of professional ethics, and of a failure to really interrogate our own profession for its role in both maintaining and, well, in first establishing and then in maintaining inequities within health. Oftentimes when we within the profession get together to talk about health inequities, we oftentimes are like, well, what's going on outside of the halls of medicine? What's going on outside of the clinics and the hospitals? What about all the systemic inequity that's in the society, broadly speaking? And that's all absolutely essential for us to critique and to be looking at very closely. But if we don't turn that lens inward to see and to name how our own practices and how our own norms within the culture of medicine are contributing to health inequity, then we're not going to be the good partners that we need to be with communities that are directly being targeted by these systems of oppression and inequity. And I'll just say also up front that I'm a non-practicing physician. I've never practiced clinical medicine for a day in my professional life. I graduated from med school, but decided by that point that I wasn't interested in clinical medicine, but I was really fascinated by the educational system behind my own training and behind our collective training as a profession. And so I've spent the last 22 years since graduating from med school really thinking deeply and working with students in the context of naming the ways in which our profession could be so much better, and naming the ways in which the practice of medicine could be so much more joyful and life-giving if we were to actually change the way that we practice care and actually took on the responsibility as members of one of the caring professions, and had difficult but very important conversations about how can we be better partners with communities and with individuals who are the ones who are directly naming the way in which inequity actually looks like. What does that actually look like in a person's life or in the life of a community?
Do you think that this will shift, that the new medical students and medical doctors coming up will have a bigger influence on this now? Because I recently saw a study that said that the majority of physicians are above the age of 55. Do you think now is a good time to really get in and make a change now that we're seeing possibly a shift into newer physicians, younger physicians?
So I just want to say, I always like to use this quote. And so I'm going to paraphrase from Michelle Obama: when you open a door, you don't let it close behind you. And so the ball is in our court, because it's very easy for us to graduate from medical school, go to residency, graduate from residency, and then you're an attending and you just kind of go, well, I guess I kind of made it. It's not as bad. Let me keep going. But if you speak to a lot of attendings, there's mistreatment there too from the corporate system, because you're kind of like a, cog in the wheel, and that's a whole nother story. But yes, I do believe that there is ability for change, because one thing that I have set in when it comes to residency. I'm in my last year right now. And, it's difficult. And one thing that I have said to folks is, I don't see Generation Z putting up with this. So I'm like kind of towards, not quite at the end of the millennials, but I'm definitely a millennial. And so I know that we push for things, but some of the things that some of my attendings, and I'll say my program is great, but some of the things that my attendings kind of push back on, I'm like, just wait till you have residents 5 years from now. Like they're going to laugh at this. So when it comes to the awareness of mental health, I think that is something else that is really changing. And like in medicine, we know that it's bad. We have not really tapped into that. We know that our trainees and our providers have some of the highest rates of depression, anxiety, suicide amongst any profession. And I do believe that residents are pushing back, medical students are pushing back and saying, we don't want wellness modules. We want an afternoon off. Like I want an afternoon where I don't have to listen to you. And I hate to say it that way, but that's the truth. We want an afternoon where we can go to the gym, spend time with your significant other, loved ones, kids, whomever. And the other piece to that is I also believe that our generation, and I know people might like laugh at this, but you always hear people say, oh, the boomers, but I honestly, my mom was in the baby boomer generation and they were out there, not all, but many were out there in the 60s. They were activists. And so I wouldn't necessarily knock the boomers, and I'm not going to point fingers at any generation, but I would say that I feel like this generation, millennials and Gen Z, definitely has it within them to step up and be activists, because that's what we need. And I can't drive that home enough, but what it's going to take is all of us. And that fact that you brought up is really good to hear, because when you look at who is still running the hospitals, the C-suite and the C-suites, when you look at who the program directors are, it doesn't even really look like many of the up and coming physicians. So I do believe a change will be there, but we can't forget, because it's very easy to get somewhere and then forget.
Yeah, I agree. I agree with what Isaiah has said here. I also, this is something I remind myself daily, is that while it's very easy to use in almost a flippant way that phrase, oh, the kids are all right, or, the kids are going to save us, that like the youngsters, the young folks are going to be the ones that save the world from all the really bad decisions that those of us have come before have either made ourselves or have tolerated or have looked the other way and have not addressed directly. I have a couple of things to say about that. First, it's always unfair to put the moral burden and the weight of responsibility of solving the world's problems on those who have just come into the world and who are literally just coming into the fullness of their power, their voice, their agency. And my birthday was yesterday. I just turned 49, so I'm solidly within the Gen X generation. And I have a whole lot of things to say about the baby boomers. My parents are baby boomers, but they are white conservative baby boomers, and that's a whole other beast. But the thing that I try to remind myself is that it's a little bit of a fantasy to believe that once the older generation dies off, everything's just going to be okay. Because if we look around and we look with clear eyes right now,
yep.
We see young white boys being becoming radicalized as incels, through various internet various internet groups. So it is not as if racism is going to somehow, it is not going to die out with the baby boomers. Sexism is not going to die out. Classism isn't going to die out. These are perpetuated generationally and cyclically. But that brings me to my other point, which is that the potential to break these cycles is truly right now, I think, perhaps better than it has been in several generations. Because Gen Y and Z in particular have come of an age in this society. And I'm only talking about the US context. I don't have a basis to be talking outside of the US context, but in the US context, Gen Y and Gen Z have grown up in a society where there has not been any protection afforded to young people, protection from the violence of this society. And I say that with a high degree of race and class consciousness, because certain segments of youth in this society have never been protected from the societal violence. Black boys in particular, Indigenous girls in particular, children who looked like me, who were white, male, middle class, had a relatively protected childhood, but by and large, the violence of the society basically broke through sort of those barriers, and now every school has active shooter drills, and that's been a reality for pretty much anybody born of within the millennial or Gen Z generation. And so I think what that has collectively led to is, one, a lack of an age of innocence. There has not been an age of innocence. And so students are coming into their power and coming into their adulthood and are looking at this world through a lens in which there's kind of a hyper awareness of the threat of violence that's constantly there in the society. And I'm starting to hear, and I have been hearing, and I'm hearing more and more of young people who are saying, absolutely not, this stops with me. These cycles, these intergenerational cycles of violence stop with me. And, and I think that I am perceiving that there are many more among the younger generations who are starting, whether they're using this language or not explicitly, are kind of stepping up and saying, this crap stops with me because this is unacceptable. It has impacted my life in ways that would have been unimaginable in a couple generations prior. And I am not going to allow any future generations to go through what I've had to go through. And I think ultimately that's what this kind of work is ultimately motivated by. It is motivated by a desire to ultimately become a good ancestor, right? If you think about like the several generations in the future, your own children or your grandchildren or your great grandchildren, what kind of world do you want them to have, and what are you doing now to prepare for that kind of a world? I hope, even though I don't have children, I hope that at some point I am counted among sort of the collective that is recognized for being a good ancestor of people who looked at the world critically, who saw where there is hurt and harm being done systematically, systemically, and across society, and are saying, no, absolutely not, this is unacceptable. And we within medicine have a particular responsibility as a profession that has a social contract with society. What is our role in looking very clear-eyed at the harm that is currently being done, or the trauma that is currently being experienced by people within this very violent society? And what is our role and responsibility to say, absolutely not, this is unacceptable, and we have power within our profession to do a part of that, to do a part to change that.
Yeah, I agree. And that runs really well with Rico's question. How can medical students acknowledge these health disparities and that they are a problem, especially since medical education uses science to justify these disparities?
Couple of things. Number one, I do believe in some medical schools and in residencies, they're starting to do more. Is it enough? No. You do have your programs that stand out, the ones that HBCUs or some of the schools, medical schools, and or programs that are more primary care based. They tend to be a little bit better at this. But what can you all do number one, educate yourself, be aware of it. But again, I know that we have a lot of cultural competency modules and classes that we do. And do I think those are the answers? Not always. I mean, sometimes you make mistakes. So I will share an example because I think that would be best for you also. I am a part of the LGBTQ community, and I many times in the clinic, especially when I started doing like hormone replacement therapy and everything, my co-residents were like, "Oh, let Isaiah see all of the gay patients." And so I pushed back on that, not because I didn't want to see them. Obviously, I would have loved to have seen them, but I said, no, you will also need to work with them because when you're out practicing, you're not going to have that opportunity. So why do I share that example? Because you will also need to get exposure. And it's okay to mess up. Most patients, sure, you'll have some who, may never want to see you again, but that's very rare. I sometimes when I don't, people assume, again, because I'm a part of the community, that I know what pronouns somebody else will use. I don't know unless they tell me. I always ask people, especially for a new patient encounter, I always ask, what pronouns do you go by? And that's how I learn. And I think that's important because you want to be sensitive to people's cultures. And so asking questions is fine too, especially when you're dealing with things such as weight loss and, diets of people who have originated from a different country versus people who might have a certain ethnicity but are identify as American. And so, or were born here. So they have some more similar diets as to we would. But my point of bringing all this up is just asking questions. I don't have a surefire way to do it because part of it for me is I don't always know and I ask. So I am grateful that schools are speaking on it more, but as again, my number one goal is to integrate and have more places that have physicians that look like our patient population, because I think that in of itself will help too, because it's much easier at most of the time to speak to a colleague about things. For example, I had a Vietnamese patient, and one of my co-residents is a Vietnamese guy, and he was kind of giving me insight into like their life, what they do. And so that kind of geared me for that visit. And so I think it's kind of a multitude of things, but it's something that you're not going to start residency, you're not going to finish medical school and say, oh, I'm good with everybody, or with every culture. You just don't know, but always asking and being respectful, that goes a long way too.
When we're talking about health disparities and kind of the framing of health disparities within the knowledge production frameworks of medicine, aka science, we are very oriented as a profession to requiring or asking for more data before we do anything. And we need to stop that, because communities who are, again, suffering suffering as targets of systemic oppression are telling us what the issues are and what they need in order for it to stop. So we don't need more data. What we need to do is we actually need to listen to those who are in the communities who are being affected by this most directly. The profession of medicine in this country is one that you cannot separate from the culture, from supremacy culture, from white supremacy, from masculine supremacy and male supremacy, cis supremacy, heterosexism, cissexism, classism, and and the profession of medicine itself is kind of an aggregation of all of that. There's data from 2017, so it's 5 years old now, but data from the AAMC that looked at the distribution of household income represented by currently enrolled medical students. And the fact of the matter is that academic medicine in this country is capitalist medicine for the capitalist class. It's capitalist medicine for the owner class. About 80% of medical students as of 2017 represented the top 2 quintiles of household income. And you cannot have equitable healthcare if you have such a gross overrepresentation of wealth within the profession itself. This is not to place the blame on the students who are in medical school. This is not about blaming students for where they've come from. This is about pointing out that when academic medicine speaks about health disparities, it refuses to acknowledge that it itself is so foundational to the problem itself. Because you cannot, as Isaiah was talking about earlier at the start of this conversation, being able to have that kind of that sort of synthesis between doctor and patient who come from similar or the same backgrounds, who share culture, who share language, who share worldview. You cannot have that kind of adequate representation if you are only pulling from the wealthiest households in this country. And because wealth and race track almost one-to-one in this society, the wealthiest are also the whitest. And so we have a huge overrepresentation of wealthy white students in medical school, and a systematic underrepresentation, but let's call it what it really is. It is a systematic exclusion of students who come from other household income backgrounds, cultural backgrounds, language backgrounds, and so on and so forth. So the science of medicine is very much interested in keeping sort of this ongoing demand for more and more data, because the longer it can kind of push out that demand for more data, the longer it can kind of push off actual systemic transformation.
And I just want to add one more point to kind of hitting at what I said earlier. Jeff is right on. You cannot expect, and I can't emphasize this enough, people in medicine are afraid to talk about finances. It's something that's not good, because a lot of medical students go through medical school and don't know how to balance anything, and because they don't have to in your medical school, partly because you're not having an income. But why am I bringing this up? You cannot expect anybody coming from an underserved background, I don't care what their race is. Unfortunately, there are more people of color that are socioeconomically disadvantaged, proportionately speaking. How can you expect them to go to undergrad, go to medical school, and take on anywhere between $180,000 to $300,000 in debt? And they come from a background where they're not making anywhere near that. They don't have a one physician, two physician household income. They don't have a mom that's a doctor or a dad that's an engineer. You get the picture. So when we talk about health disparities, for me, health disparities goes hand in hand with social determinants of health, right? And so I'm sure many of you know what social determinants of health are, but just to give you an example of a few: household income, location to grocery stores that have good food versus food that's cheap, and you get the picture. How many fast food restaurants are on every corner? So I can go on and on and on about this, but we cannot expect the system to change. We can't expect to see the type of change that I know most of us want to see if we do not address the cost of medical school. And I can't stress that enough. It is very important, and most people just don't want to hear it. So how can you guys make a difference? I also said this at the beginning: voting, and not just voting, talking to your legislators about the problem, right? Because some of them don't know. I was in DC just 3 months ago for the AAFP Advocacy Summit, and one thing that we were talking on is the pay disparity between Medicaid and Medicare. Why is this important? And I'm going to tie this back to what we're talking about. There's a lot of people disproportionately of color who are on Medicaid. What is wrong with Medicaid? In Florida, a lot of specialists, even a lot of primary care practices, are not taking Medicaid. Okay, what does that mean for the patients? Where are they going to go? And then something that's even more enlightening: if they have Medicaid, they cannot necessarily go to these free clinics that we have in Florida because they have insurance. So at times, the people who have Medicaid are worse off than people who don't have insurance. So this is a whole nother topic, but I'm saying all of this to get back to how can you make a difference? Using your voice. because many times, especially for the pre-meds and for the first and second year medical students who don't get a lot of time in the clinic, they're always asking, how can I get involved? How can I help my patients? Think about it this way. You can really help your patients. You can really make a big difference by trying to help evolve the system and using your voice. And that's one thing I love about AMSA, because that's something that we pride ourselves on trying to equip everybody, no matter if they're pre-med, med, residents, attendings, on doing, and we're all learning. None of us are experts at advocacy. We continue to learn. So that's how I think you can address health disparities.
Mhm.
Does anyone have any questions that they would like to ask at this time?
Yeah, I got a quick question, since you brought it up about the physicians not accepting the Medicaid. Is this rooted in like a systemic problem, as far as, like you said, that people of color were more disproportionately on Medicaid? So are the physicians in Florida not accepting Medicaid because of that, or is it because there's an alternative like gain from the government where you get paid more for Medicare versus Medicaid?
You just hit it on the latter. So so specifically speaking to Florida, and I can speak to Ohio a little bit. I don't know as much anymore because I'm not there, but in Florida, we pay for Medicaid about 40 to 50 cents on the dollar as compared to Medicare. Why is that? Well, if you look online, it doesn't take much. The federal government actually put money towards Medicaid expansion, and the Florida legislator, for whatever reason, left over $1 billion on the table. And so I could go on and on about that, but I want to stick to the topic. You can't, many of these practices are not turning away Medicaid patients because they're of color. That's not what's happening. What's happening is they don't get paid as much for doing those services. And these people also need to think about keeping their offices open, paying their staff. So if it doesn't pay enough, they're not going to do it. So at first, Rico, I'll be honest with you, when I first started residency and I heard that stat, I was like, these mean providers, I can't, but then I started thinking about the business side of medicine. And even if, and I'll share this with you, you can be as good-hearted as you want to be, but you also have to pay your staff. You have to pay your staff. And so it's an issue. So again, advocating for this is a big thing. And that's why that's one of the big reasons I went to the AAFP Advocacy Summit, because I'm like, this is something that I live day in and day out.
Thanks for asking that question, Rico, because it's a great opportunity to talk about how we are all caught up and entangled in the for-profit healthcare system, which there are lots of capitalist doctors out there. So I am not going to paint with a broad brush that all doctors are fundamentally oriented in a way that recognizes the problem of for-profit healthcare. But we within AMSA certainly cultivate a critical consciousness about the fundamental conflicts and irreducible contradictions of saying that you can have a for-profit healthcare system. Because ultimately everybody gets caught up in it, regardless of whether it aligns with your values or not. Because Isaiah is exactly right. Like ultimately we have to operate. We have no choice, or well, we have very little choice in this society to operate outside of a capitalist paradigm. Functionally, we have zero chance of operating fully outside of a capitalist paradigm. And those of us who come into medicine, presumably most of us who come into medicine with a deep sense of a call to help people, to increase good in the world, to reduce harm in the world, to reduce trauma in the world, to attend to people in the needs that they have as they journey through their lives, ultimately get to a place where there is an irreconcilable difference or irreconcilable tension between the demands of a for-profit driven system and what is actually a social good that should be distributed equitably, fairly, and justly to everybody in accordance with the needs that they have. if we had that kind of a system, then we could talk about thriving and flourishing, but we don't have that kind of a system. And so instead we talk about how do we minimize the harm, the trauma, the death, and the disease burden that comes with health inequities, and which is an inseparable part of a for-profit healthcare system. So, yes, I will rage against capitalist for-profit healthcare till the day that I die, and I hope I get to live long enough to see capitalist healthcare taken down, because it is the cause for so much burden of disease, of illness, of suffering, of harm, of trauma, of death. And we are caught up in it, and we are moral agents within this system. So our hands are not clean. It may not be that we have the full agency to be the kind of healthcare provider that we want to be in a for-profit driven healthcare system, but we have moral agency, and ultimately that means that we have to accept the moral responsibility that comes with this. And it is our moral responsibility as a profession to ask ourselves, how are we contributing to harm? Because we say our first principle of ethics is that we do no harm, or we minimize the harm that we do. So how is our participation, our ongoing participation in a system that prioritizes profit, even in those aspects of it that are ultimately run by our government, but they're run within a for-profit healthcare system, so they're ultimately not set up to be successful, and we have to contend with that. It's really hard because just as Dr. Cochran is saying, like, you are caught between a rock and a hard place in the sense that you may feel deeply compelled to work with people who are pushed to the margins of the society, and if you have your own clinic, or if you are an employee of a healthcare system, you may not be able to do what you feel called morally to do.
All right, the next question comes from Yamea. Hopefully I'm saying your name right. The question is, how much of a role does tertiary prevention in medicine prevent medical doctors and students from understanding and addressing the root causes of disparities?
I have a short thought on this, and and then Isaiah, I think from a clinical standpoint, perhaps you're better equipped to answer this one. But from a standpoint of looking at how physicians are trained to look at our society at a systems level, we as a profession are oriented only to be looking most closely at the relationship between an individual person's health and their individual context. We are not well trained to be able to understand how societies are set up from a sociological standpoint, from an anthropological standpoint, from a cultural studies standpoint. We are not exposed to those systems of social analysis in a systematized way within our own education and training. And so a lot of physicians will come out of their training and not have the lenses available to them, or will not have the tools of social critique available to them to be able to understand the connections between social policy, social structures, institutions, and then the impact on individual people or smaller communities. And so I think a lot of physicians become lost in that they don't know how to analyze and how to connect the dots, which is something that we do a lot within AMSA, is sit with students and talk about, okay, what do you notice about these systems? What are you picking up on? And how can we look at this from a standpoint that isn't only within the biopsychosocial model of medical education? What do community organizers have to say about this? What do artists have to say about this, and writers have to say about this? What do sociologists have to say about this? What do theologians have to say about this? You know, I mean, like we need to incorporate these perspectives from outside of this very narrow range of lenses that we within the profession are trained to use in order to be able to understand the connections between upstream and downstream effects of social structures and health disparities.
Do you think that medical schools having a class that would integrate all of these topics together would be beneficial to medical students?
It'd be a start.
It's a start. And there are some that do, there are some that don't. But having that for 2 weeks or even a month during your first and second year doesn't do it, because then you get to third year, fourth year, nobody's doing it, nobody's talking about it. All the residents are busy, so on. You get the picture, right?
Mm-hmm.
What I will say selfishly is that bragging on family medicine and primary care, I think you will see that more in these fields, that especially younger program directors. My program director is in her early 40s. So therefore, she's a little bit more in tune with it and doing some great work. She's the current FAFP president. So I'm very excited about that, because she's able to introduce some of this at the state level. So to answer the question directly, how do I think tertiary prevention is leading to all of these issues, essentially? Because like Jeff said, we're focused sometimes just on, and I don't want to fault any trainee, I don't want to fault any physician, but we're focused on the problem in front of us. And that's what we've been taught, to analyze, to get to the crux of the problem in terms of the science. And then when you get to residency, especially when you're in primary care, you go, oh my God, I need to know all of the science and all the medicine. But honestly, sometimes I'm like, that's 20% of my patient visit. 80% of my patient visit is the social structure, okay? And so I really, now as moving in as a third year as chief resident, I really try to get the interns in the second years to really focus on it. And I have to say that I'm always very happy and with the group of residents I'm with. They do focus on the patient as a whole. And I think part of that is the intake that you do with your patients. So when you ask them questions, it's important to ask them, where are they from? Where have they been? What does their life look like? Because I don't believe that you can take care of a patient if you don't know them, especially in primary care, because it's so easy to go over like what's in front of you on paper. And I call it physician inertia or provider inertia, where you inherit a patient, they're new to you, and you see what's on their problem list and you go, okay, that's what I need to treat. And that's all you ask them about. You don't ask them about anything else. And then one day they come in and they tell you, oh, hey, I live in a house that was built in 1920 something. And I'm just bringing this up because then they're sick, and it makes you think like, well, are there things going on? So getting the whole picture will lead to you taking better care of your patient. So I think that, like Jeff was saying, like we have to really, and it's hard because a lot of us are not trained to do it, but that's part of primary care is really getting to know your patient. And I think that can lead to better outcomes. On a higher level, as you all can tell, I'm really into the advocacy and policy on a higher level. Our healthcare system is still very, in my opinion, reactionary. We react to things, we react to things, we react to things. I think that's how our society still is. Mm-hmm. We need to be more preventative minded. And so we're getting there. And again, being in family medicine, my mind is always, yes, I want to take care, is always on, yes, I want to take care of what you have going on, but I also need to make sure I'm doing my prevention, getting my vaccines. But what does that look like at the systemic level? We need funding. We need to be able to get this out to everybody, because what do we do to the people who don't have access to a family medicine physician or a primary care physician? It's all of the time. I see at my hospital when I'm on the inpatient side of things, somebody who hasn't been to the physician or a provider for 10 years. And so when you get labs on them, you're just like, oh my goodness. And the patient was like, but I felt fine. And they don't come in until they don't feel fine. And by then, many times it's too late. And so just really changing that at a higher level. But part of it is funding, part of it is how we just look at the healthcare system. And Jeff was right on. Capitalism in medicine, like we have in everything else, it is something that drives me mad, and it's something that affects those who are underserved. And I can just be in, I'll stop after this, but during this COVID pandemic that we had, we saw the disparities that exist when it comes to people who were getting it, and we came to vaccine dissemination. Even though it was free, people were like, it's free. Why is it hard for people to get there? Okay, so let's have a conversation about the person who works an hourly wage job and the pharmacy closes at 6 p.m. and they don't get off work until 5:30, if not later. How are they going to get the vaccine? Or let's talk about in Florida, how Publix are on every corner in middle class and well-to-do areas, but in the inner city, you can't find a Publix hardly anywhere. Like, think about that. So I can walk to 3 different Publixes. I literally can walk to them. Down some places, I live in Orlando. In some areas in Orlando, you can't do that. In some areas in Miami, you can't do that. And I said to my partner, Michael, I'm like, this is social determinants of health. And I feel like at this point, my partner's an architect, and I feel like at this point, he could probably give a talk on all this too, because every day I say it. Those are the things that need to be addressed.
Isaiah, you bring up such a good point, though. We maybe not architects, but city planners. Like, we need to also be, I don't know if an architect is quite the, but like in relation to our built structure, we talk about how budgets are moral documents, but we never talk about how the built structure of our society reflects our morals as well. It reflects our values. It reflects what we think of as important, or who we think of as important or worthwhile. And since you brought up the pandemic and health disparities, that the curtain was fully pulled back over these last few years, and the pandemic is still going on. We really need to, as a profession, we need to be talking about how we are co-opted professionally into a death economy. And death economy is exactly what it sounds like. It is an economy that presumes that there is a necessary level of death, or suffering that must be there in order to ensure that the benefits of that society are going to those who supposedly deserve it. I wish if I had my one wish for MedEd, it would be that every first-year medical student spends the entire year thinking about the concept of biopolitics and biopower, which is it's a word that comes out of critical social theory, but it is really simple. It is huge. It's a huge concept, and you could think about it forever, but it is effectively the apparatus of the state that works to determine and deliver resources for flourishing to those it deems worthy, and effectively denial denial of those same resources to those that the society deems unworthy. And healthcare professionals, doctors, nurses, anybody who's working in healthcare is by definition part of this biopolitics, or part of this biopower, because we ourselves are resources. Healthcare providers themselves are societal resources, and how we are distributed across communities, across geographies, across different segments of our class strata, of our racial divides enforced through racism, the gender divides within healthcare, the fact that healthcare has obsessively focused on the male body and largely ignores what happens within bodies identified as female, or how medicine talks about gender itself is super problematic. So my words here are inadequate to even name how we create these strata within across gender, race, class, ability, and so on and so forth. And we ourselves are part of this apparatus that says these are the ones who get to live and thrive and flourish, and these are the ones who don't. They're lucky if they get to survive.
Yeah, that's a very interesting point, and I've actually never heard of those two words before, biopolitics and biopower. So I'll definitely be looking into that more. And then we have a question from Rico again that says, do you think that a lack of motivation to pursue medical school or structural barriers prevent minorities from pursuing medical education?
So I think I've spoken on the fact that I think it's structural barriers. Okay, again, and I really want to hit this hard. I just do not. I've been on so many calls over the last 2 to 3 years about, and essentially it's, and I think Jeff has heard me say this. People ask me, I think because I'm of color, I'm LGBTQ, how do we address this? How did you get into medicine? And I always say, listen, my mom was a teacher, and I had the leg up in that realm because I knew what it was like to study. I knew what it was like to get through school. Financially speaking, it was difficult. I had to work hard. I had to, and like, not discrediting from anybody else. Everybody has to work hard to get through medical school. It's not easy. Everybody has to work hard to get through undergrad and residency. But I can't stress enough how much of a burden it is on somebody who doesn't already have financial backing. Your parents are not necessarily there, are not going to be there to help you when something happens, right? So when you're medical school, you still needed to have a car to get around for the most part, right? Same thing for residency. And so when you think about a medical student, most of the time a medical student is not working. And if they are, they could be tutoring here and there, right? So they don't have nobody really has a real income, but you still have bills, you still have things to pay for, okay? You get to residency and then the same thing. And then you talk to people who, you talk to people when you see that you start worrying about more things like, okay, you know, my credit score, this, that, and the other, it builds, right? And the credit score system is a whole nother thing that I could talk about in terms of, you know, being a inherently racist systemic thing that I just don't even want to get into right now because I could talk forever about it. But Rico, I feel like in order to address this, I think I wholeheartedly believe that we do need to reduce the cost of medical school. We need to look at changing that, because until then, I do not believe we're going to see the change that we want to see, especially, again, when we have other fields that are continuing to boom. When you have tech, when you have these fields, I have lots of friends of color who are brilliant and they're, you know, computer software engineers. And I'm not saying that those jobs are always, you know, easy and all of that, but still, when you look at somebody, my friends look at me and say, oh my God, you're still training, you're almost 30. And I'm like, yeah, it's a long process. And that's me in family medicine residencies, it's 3 years, which is the shortest residency you can do in the US. So imagine if you're a surgeon or something. So we really have to look at this system. This is a system that hasn't really been changed for a long time, almost 100 years, if not more. It's time for change. We need to actually address the system too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the fact of the matter is that medical education, the model of it was defined by the Flexner Report that was published in 1910, and Abraham Flexner himself was a racist, sexist bigot. And his recommendations for the structure of standardizing med ed literally led to the closure of 80% of the schools that were operating at that time that admitted Black students into medical training. And within, I think, 5 or 10 years of the publication of the Flexner Report, all but 2 medical schools that were admitting Black students at the time were closed. And there, you know, and then there was a study published a few years ago that looked at that kind of not projected out, but looked at what the deficit of Black physicians in this country is, that directly related to the closure of the schools that were closed because of Flexner's report. And it was something like the order of 40 or 50,000 physicians. So when we're talking about Black physicians in particular, So when we're talking about a relative an underrepresentation of Black physicians, of Indigenous physicians, none of this happens by accident. This is all by the design of the system itself, which is why the schools themselves don't really want to talk about this in this way, because they are all caught up in it, and they are the ones whose admissions policies and procedures have continued to perpetuate the exclusion of Black students, of Indigenous students, of students of color in general, of students who are economically disenfranchised in this country. So this is an aggregation of this is such a good example of a system that is designed to aggregate resources and opportunities into a smaller and smaller and smaller number of people, and leaving behind larger and larger and larger groups of people, and then wondering what's the problem, or how do we solve this problem? And the act of innocence is very much part of the charade. This whole question of like, well, we don't know what's wrong, or we need a study to tell us what's wrong. No, you don't. If we were honest about how this was actually designed, nobody would need a study. Nobody would need a study. And we have to also deal with the fact that our current educational environment is, and the culture of medical education, the culture of education in this country, just broadly speaking, but the culture of medical education in particular, is a very, very violent system, especially for students of color, especially for Black students and Indigenous students. There is a tremendous amount of dehumanization and subhumanization that continues to happen. And while there are these diversity and equity initiatives, the whole DEI project, very, very few institutions are actually changing their policies and changing the culture and the structure of the school to make these educational environments safe and supportive and affirming of students who currently are identified as quote unquote underrepresented or quote unquote historically excluded, as if it's historical. It is as much present as it is historical. So there's a lot that we have to, we have to name this and then hold our institutions accountable. Because honestly, when institutions honestly begrudgingly admit, a few extra Black students here or there so that they can get their percentages up to 6%, 7% Black students, it is done in a way that is really disingenuous. It's done in a way where ultimately the students who come into these systems very quickly recognize that this was not forever for them, and it was not designed for them, and it is still not designed for them. And what we have seen in medicine just in the last couple of years are some very high profile examples of Black women physicians who are actively being pushed out of medicine because the work environments are so hostile towards them. I mean, hell, one of the medical schools in the South has its accreditation on probation currently because of the hostile environment that's largely directed at Black physicians and I think healthcare providers of color. How do we who would want to be in that kind of an environment?
I don't think anyone would, and there's no way that anyone can thrive in an environment like that. Probably not even survive in an environment like that. And then how are you as a physician going to be capable of taking care of other people when you are so pushed down constantly in that place?
Can I just for like 30 seconds just speak on that? You said something very important when you said surviving. So social media is a wonderful thing, and also can be not so good, but social media is shedding a lot of light on what's happening within medicine. So many people will say things like, I didn't know that my medical student or resident trained this much and is on the job for this long and did a 24-hour shift or did a 36-hour shift or hasn't gotten a day off in X, Y, and Z. And why am I bringing this up? Because now we're starting to see, I think some of you who are on Med Twitter and on Instagram and follow certain handles like Woke Doctors, there was a recent suicide. There's always a suicide, which is so sad, you know, and I'm not discrediting suicides that have happened in other realms, but I feel like it's a weekly thing in medicine, and I hear it all the time. I'm sure you've heard the name, and if you haven't, I'm going to tell you, Pamela Weibel is somebody who has tried to do a lot of work in this space. But think about just in general, just for anybody going through medicine, having those thoughts just because of what's going on, because of how hard it is. But then you add on to the fact that you're a minority, and you're facing extra pressure, you're facing extra things. So again, how do we attract people to a field that now has, the MO of medicine is not, people out there say, oh, I wouldn't want to be a doctor. I hear of all the things you guys have to go through. Think about that. That's not something that, how can you sell medicine to people? And I'm going to be honest with you here. I've tried to sell medicine to people of color, and some of my friends who are just finished residency or towards the end of residency, we've all said, I don't necessarily know I would suggest medicine to some people now. And I know it sounds bad, but I'm saying this because I also am thinking about them and their families. And do I want them to be subjected to some of the things that we have been subjected to? And the answer is no. But at the same time, I want them to enter medicine because I want my patients to get the care that they need. So I would never tell people I regret what I do. I love what I do. But at the same time, I found the AMSA. If it wasn't for AMSA, and I've said this many times, if it wasn't for AMSA, do I think I would have gotten through medical school? In residency, I do not think so. I do not think so, because I was able to have my mind on a bigger vision and know that, yes, I can do this. I can be in the trenches, but there's a way that I can make a difference.
Mm-hmm.
All right, does anyone else have any more questions?
I'll ask one more before we leave. Just advice for everybody that's on the call. I know you guys touched on it a little bit. What would be your advice to medical students, pre-medical students, as to calling out these things when they see them and not being fearful of being punished by hierarchy, by institutions, by the professors, by their attendings, residents, and so forth?
You're essentially asking, how can people speak up against this? How can people speak up against mistreatment?
I mean, with the fear of being, pushed out or being, or like how you said, how the women physicians are catching slack for speaking out of the workplace environment. So, what would, I guess, the motivation to people to have that courage to do it? I mean, if they want to,
So surprisingly, I will share, obviously, as in my role as chief, I hear a lot of different things. And one of my junior residents, who is a African-American female, had an incident with an attending physician who is, just says things off the cuff. And she made a comment about something in her note, and he was reading through it, and he said, "Are you from this country?" No, like just like that. And it really hurt her. And she, being bold, said, "Yes, I am. Are you from this country?" Now, I don't encourage you to do that, because there could have been an issue there, but he just laughed it off and they kept moving. But why do I bring this up? Because she did come to me about it. And then I actually went to our program director, because this is something that we don't stand for. So not all programs have this. And again, I'm in family medicine. I know in surgery and some other fields where it's a little bit rougher, people are scared to speak up. But I always say, even if you can't find an ally within your program, within your hospital, finding somebody to tell and speak to and call it out is important, because you have to. Because if you don't do it, then it could be worse for the next person. And I know that retaliation is something that everybody fears, because the thought is, I've made it this far. I don't want to get in trouble and mess up. I just need to keep my head down and do what I need to do. And one thing I do tell people is, you can you can be respectful, but don't keep your head down. You can address things respectfully. You don't have to, pop off and cuss and yell, but you do need to address it, because if you don't do it, it could hurt someone else even more. And what if that's the person who was already on the edge and then they go home and they kill themselves? Like that's all it takes. You have to speak up. In most programs now, I will say within the ACGME, any medical provider who works with a resident physician, you can actually, even if you have to go above your program director, you can report to ACGME for now. That is actually there's language in the ACGME that does not allow for any of that.
That's really good to know, Isaiah, because that's because when we talk about the way in which the way in which our profession trains those who are within the stage of education and training as the newest members of our profession, we have to be honest about how a lot of what is passed off as norms of med ed is actually ritualized abuse, hazing, and coercion into participating in ritualized abuse and hazing. Trainees of one stage ritually abusing or ridiculing or belittling the cohort that is one stage or two stages below or behind in terms of the education. We have a context within our profession that always reminds me of a quote from Resmaa Menakem, who's a cultural somatic theorist who talks about who looks at trauma and how does trauma show up in societies and cultures and in family groups. And he has this amazing quote that I promise you, he was not thinking about the profession of medicine when he said this, but I have never heard a quote that's more apt to the profession of medicine. He said, trauma decontextualized within a person can look like personality. Trauma decontextualized within a family group can look like family traits. Trauma decontextualized within a people can look like culture. And I have thought long and hard about how that quote, to me, reveals the extent to which the culture of medical education is actually a culture of trauma and a culture of cycles of trauma, of abuse, or trauma that comes by way of abuse. And, we have this notion within our profession of like, well, this is the way it was when I was a resident, or this is the way it was when I was a medical student. And so you're going to have to suffer in it the way that I did. That is, first of all, that is just morally reprehensible. We cannot accept that we will just continue in these cycles of abuse forever, and that we just need to suck it up. Because at that point, then I will actively campaign against anybody going into the profession of medicine, because at that point, you're just talking about literally going into a context of intentional harm. And this is a moment where we really need a reckoning within the profession. I have heard stories just in the last several weeks from students that have kept me up at night, because they are such egregious examples of the way in which students are coerced into doing something that is against their own moral code and should be against the moral code of our profession, but they are coerced into doing it because it's supposedly good for their training, or it's what I did and therefore you need to do as well. And that we cannot allow that to continue. So this conversation when we're talking about health inequities, we're talking ultimately about the way in which people are hurt and harmed by systems within systems, and these are systems of violence, and our own training is caught up within a system of violence. So as we think about how can we be moral agents for good, for reducing harm, for reducing trauma, for stopping cycles of abuse within our larger society, we can start within our own profession and actually start treating our own within the profession. We can start treating our own professional colleagues with the ethics of care that we claim to be committed to providing to our patients, to communities, to the larger society. But we have to start from within as well. We have got to clean up the house of medicine, because right now it's a household of abuse.
Yeah, I think that's a very powerful point that you bring up, and a great way to end this session is for all of us to really look inward and to see what we can do to make a difference, how we can change our opinions, and how we can move forward to change the system that we're in.
Morgan, do you mind if I add one last thing, because I meant to say this up front?
Yeah.
You all, as students and trainees, are deeply caught up in a hierarchical system of power, where a lot of people use power to, they do not use power in a form of power with or power for. They use power as, as an expression of dominate. They use power to dominate. And so medical students in particular, pre-med students and medical students, are particularly vulnerable to abuses of power when they speak up. And so it is always, always, always your first priority to protect yourself in the moment, because ultimately no one of us can change the system. So we have to gather, we have to come together to fight these abuses of power, because in that way, then they cannot simply retaliate against one person, which is very much a risk for individual med students. Now, there are moments where perhaps you feel that you have the safety, the security, the power, and perhaps the privilege as well to actually speak up and speak out. Those of us whose embodiment comes with societal power, those of us who are racialized as white and therefore have power within a white supremacist society, those of us who are embodied in ways that is recognized as male or masculine and therefore have access to power in a masculinist society. It's our responsibility, and this is why I speak the way that I do. It's our responsibility to use the power that has been very unfairly granted to us, to use it to delegitimize the system that has granted us this power, and ultimately to destabilize it and dismantle it. That is my ethical responsibility as someone who's been granted unjust amounts of power and privilege in a society that is masculinist, that is cis sexist, that is white supremacist, that is Western chauvinist, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That's my ethical responsibility. I have to call it out. Even if I benefit from the system, it's an unethical system of violence, and that I can't abide by that and call myself a good or ethical person.
All right. Well, I want to thank you both for coming here tonight and speaking with us. I know I've learned a lot in this almost 90 minutes being here with you guys. But thank you. I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Rico.
Yeah, I just want to echo everything Morgan said. And Morgan, great job hosting tonight. But thank you both, Dr. Cochi and Dr. Cochran, for coming on and speaking. I can listen to you guys for days and hopefully come up with solutions with you all. Would you mind dropping your emails in the chat if you don't mind, for people to ask questions, maybe follow up if they need to. And just also thank you everyone for tuning in. You all have been strong throughout the week, and we do have one more session tomorrow that's on osteopathic awareness, and a letter to the editor and op-ed training that we'll be hosting tomorrow. So hope you all can make it. It is at 2 p.m. though, it's not Eastern time, but we all hope to see you. And again, great session and great conversation, and hope you all have a great evening.
And remember to vote. Please vote.
Yes, go vote.
Go vote. Thank you, Morgan, and thank you, Rico, for hosting.